Thank you. And on that note, let's invite Ms. Diana Gray to the podium for her briefing. Thank you again, ECHO, for being here. I do have questions for you, but I reserve them to keep today's meeting flow going. But if you all can, or if Amelia of my team, we'll follow up with you all offline for my questions. But Ms. Diana Gray.
Thank you, and I was already going to give big thanks to ECHO and talk about how smart they were even before they gave HSD kudos, but thank you so much for that. We sometimes get asked about the data, and we always point to ECHO as the holder of this really important administrative data source that they have increasingly used in really thoughtful and nuanced ways to try to go deeper so that we understand what's happening in this population. So I will, understanding that we have a little bit of a time limitation, go fairly quickly today, and we just have a few topics to cover. I wanted to give a quick update on the HEAL initiative, talk about the ongoing shelter assessment, which I think will address many of the questions that you have rightly raised today, touch on the process for the marshalling yard, temporary use as a sheltering facility, the restoration of downtown shelter bed capacity, and related to all of those, some of the reallocation of ARPA funds that is allowing some of those items to move forward. Yesterday morning, we initiated the HEAL initiative intervention in our 13th encampment on the Violet Crown Trail along the Gaines Creek Greenbelt. So that work is ongoing. We had enumerated, I will tell you, 85 individuals in that encampment, so it's quite large. So we will be relocating people through this week and have a report early next week about the number of people that accept transfer into shelter. One of the ways that we're able to do that is that, as you may recall, we have doubled or are doubling occupancy in our bridge shelters. The first one is Northbridge, which the city operates, so we're going from 65 to about 130 beds so that we can accommodate this encampment and future individuals. Prior to this relocation, have over the course of the HEAL initiative moved about 486 people from high priority encampments into bridge shelters. And I want to pause and talk about what we mean by high priority encampments. It's not acceptable for people to be living unsheltered under any conditions, but in order to think about how we use our city resources to address this issue thoughtfully and based on data and really understanding how we use our resources most effectively, the team has developed a tool where we assess health and safety risks in these encampments that range from the health and safety of the people in the encampment to the impacts on resources, infrastructure, and neighbors who may be nearby. We have thus far permanently rehoused 186 individuals. One of the things that I want to point out is that every time we have been briefing council, one of the things that we're noting is that the time from entry into shelter to moving into permanent housing has been creeping up. And that is reflective of, because we are using rapid rehousing, which is tenant-based, meaning people have rental assistance, they have a case manager, but they have to find a unit. Our challenge in finding units in the community has increased. It's always been tough, but that's something that we will be working on with ECHO as a primary partner to really ensure that we can get access to more of those scattered site units, and also is an area in which site-based housing, so a brick and mortar housing development, is really important because those units are dedicated to the population. So we're not having to negotiate with landlords in quite the same way. As we've noted before, when offered transfer into bridge shelter, the rate of acceptance of people is about 85%, so most folks will come into shelter. I do think that, one thing we want to signal is that we acknowledge that there is some tension between the relative security, safety, privacy of having one's own room and serving more people by doubling occupancy. We may see some shift in the rates of acceptance But, we have made a determination that on balance, the need to get people into shelter calls for us to take this approach for the time being. So last year, as we, or Council approved the emergency shelters, which brought Urban Alchemy on to operate the Arch and Austin Area Urban League in to operate Southbridge, Council asked us to do an assessment of our shelter system. And so that assessment is initially really looking at our year-round system with additional planning to come for weather-based shelter, cold weather shelter, potentially heat shelter. And then with the IFC that passed last week, we will also be giving some special attention to the question of geographic dispersion and giving Council some outline of what we anticipate costs could look like were expansion of shelter beds in our future collectively. And so our staff has been working on this since January. We have spent significant amounts of time doing engagement with stakeholders, from people experiencing homelessness to service providers that are actually providing shelter themselves, other service providers, and other community stakeholders. We are now at a stage where we have a number of preliminary recommendations that are being refined, and staff are now sharing those with a wide variety of stakeholders to get additional feedback, and expect to advance recommendations and observations to Council by the end of the month. I do want to note that when we're looking at a community shelter system, the city does not own or control the entire system. We own a significant number of the facilities where shelter beds are found, but not all of them. And we are not the only funder, nor should we be. And so we've been asked to make recommendations, set a vision and priorities, but in order to achieve or execute on all of those recommendations, that will not and should not be only a city effort. The timing, I think, is important because we have been asked to do this before we resolicit the emergency contracts for the Arch and Southbridge. And so as we bring these recommendations forward to Council by the end of the month and in July, we would then be positioned to go ahead and issue those RFPs. I should note also that one of the requests that Council made was that as part of our recommendations, we give specific ideas about how we might improve our contracting process and the scope, the requirements, et cetera, in our shelter contracts to improve the functioning of the system, since we are one of the largest funders, if not the largest funder. So while the final recommendations are forthcoming, we wanted to share some emerging themes with you. And those fall into three categories. One is, and I think will not be surprising, that we certainly see a need to increase the capacity of our shelter system. The second is that as a system, we really need to look at efficiencies and coordination. How are we working across individual shelters and in referral pathways, et cetera, to make sure that we're using those resources most effectively? And then specifically, what do we want to see in across the system in individual shelters to make sure that the quality of service delivery and effectiveness is as high as it can be? We certainly have a gap in general population shelter beds. So single adults experiencing homelessness being the largest population, and the population that on a per capita basis probably has the smallest or the least access to shelter beds. However, we also know that, and continue to hear, that we need to pay special attention to particular populations, women, people who identify as women, people with medical needs, LGBTQIA population, and that particularly in the face of a scenario in which we don't have shelter beds for everyone, we probably will be looking at some prioritization for particularly vulnerable populations. And then the question of geographic diversity that's been brought up here this evening, or this morning, excuse me. It feels like a long day already, guys. From the system perspective, We really, right now, have a scenario in which most shelters maintain individual wait lists. And so people who are seeking shelter, or if, say, our community health paramedics find someone in the community who really needs to be inside, they're kind of faced with going to a particular shelter operator and asking for access or to be put on a waiting list. And we really want to, explore ways that we can do a better job of that. That will both make sure that people get in who most need it, and our hope is that we really maximize the bed utilization in existing shelters. We need to have diversion and rapid exit services at all entry points. So one of the things that you saw in Echo's slides was that number of people who access permanent housing with what is called their minimal housing resources. So you've spent a little bit of time in shelter, maybe you had some help with deposit money, utility, et cetera. Those people who can be rehoused quickly, we really need to lean into that space. Because, I think, Councilmember Vela, you spoke to the longer someone is unsheltered and, frankly, homeless at all, the barriers accrue, right? Their health deteriorates, their situation deteriorates. So we're really looking at, with our partners, how do we make sure that there's some flexible funding accessible to our shelter providers, so that when someone presents or comes in, if we can get them out quickly, we do it. And then I think I want to, just talk about, for operations, we continue to need to be low barrier shelter. Really, the restrictions that we have in shelter are related to the safety of occupants and staff, but we make it as easy for people to come in as possible. An example of that is pets. There are a lot of people who won't come into shelter if they have to be separated from their pets, or even from their partners. In cases where we have couples, we may need to accommodate for that. Finally, one of the areas that we've seen a real impact of the labor market tightening is in our shelter system. They have traditionally been very, low-wage, entry-level jobs. I do want to acknowledge that many of our shelter providers have responded. They've had to the market by raising that compensation level. But the combination of adequate compensation and training for staff that are in, difficult environments is really important to drive down turnover, which in turn impacts the experience of folks in shelter. So speaking to the ratio of shelter beds to our population overall, when our staff looked at our total shelter portfolio and compared it to using the point-in-time count numbers, we are on the low end of number of beds, shelter beds, compared to our overall homeless population, To Matt's point, we are also on the low end of permanent housing compared to our our homeless population. So I think it points out sort of a relatively poorly resourced system in both cases. So while we are working on the recommendations and the plans for longer-term shelter, we do have two temporary facilities that either have come before council already or are expected to come before council in the coming weeks. The marshalling yard, which is, is an Austin Convention Center facility that was completed late last year, has been proposed as a temporary shelter facility. We released an RFP May 12th, have received proposals under that RFP. Evaluation should be complete this week, and expect to have a recommendation mid-next week for an award. Right now is expected to be on the July 20th agenda. The ask of those of the offerers was to shelter up to 300 individuals. It's a 24-hour shelter, so folks are not asked to leave during the day, and to detail what the service array looks like, everything from basic services such as meals, hygiene facilities, et cetera, to case management and supportive services, how they will advance safety and security on site. And I think importantly also, because of the location of this, transportation to ensure that individuals don't have to go on foot to the closest bus stop necessarily, but that we would have some sort of a shuttle that helped folks get to transportation lines and potentially to frequent destinations for the guests that are served there. The anticipated term is for 1 year. We did immediately after the announcement hold a series of virtual community meetings. Based on those meetings, HSD has posted an FAQ, a frequently asked question, on the Speak Up page, and that is based on more than 100 questions that were submitted during those sessions or beyond. That's certainly not the end of the community engagement on this front, but want you to know that that is there as a resource for you to the degree that you have questions from your constituents on the project. The next temporary project is the restoration of the downtown shelter capacity in the former Salvation Army site. Last Thursday, Council approved a 1-year lease with the Salvation Army for the facility, as well as an amendment to an existing contract with Urban Alchemy that will allow them to operate there. It is on the same block, so in terms of convenience and sort of economy of scale, I think very positive. And staff is negotiating that contract amendment with Urban Alchemy now, so I don't have final populations for you, but I will tell you that I'm comfortable saying we expect there will be set-aside beds for women there, which has been something we've heard in the community since we lost beds upon the closure of the Salvation Army facility. We're looking at 150 beds, and there are some repairs that need done to the building before we're operational, but looking to do that, we hope by the end of July, and we'll continue to update Council on the timeline for occupancy. Finally, we have utilized for both of these projects American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and this comes from our first really significant reallocation within the investment plan for ARPA, which is summarized here. So we did move funds from a number of investment areas for a total increase in the shelter resource of $15.2 million. Again, these totals are only for the state and local fiscal relief funds. There is another $10.6 million in home ARPA, which will be separately dedicated. It has other program guidelines. And then wanted to give Council a sense of where we are in terms of the commitment for all of these funds. Based on the approval of the downtown shelter restoration and the outstanding RFP for the marshalling yards, if all of those are approved and move forward, when we look at monies that have been spent, that are encumbered in contracts now, that are in fiscal year 24 authorized contracts, or direct staffing and program and expense that is anticipated, we have some sort of commitment for 87% of the funds. What is left, the $3.6 million, really falls into, I believe, 5 categories. We have a little bit, some resources to cover some carrying costs of the hotels that are being converted to permanent supportive housing until they open, but it's modest. That's under $1 million. Excuse me, have a little bit of money left for shelter, about $750,000, $1 million left for a second phase of capacity building with community organizations, $1 million for landlord engagement, which I spoke to earlier, the need to get more landlords offering units, and then finally $300,000 for communications to improve our communications overall around the homelessness issue. With that, I will stop and happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. Colleagues, Vice Chair Velasquez.
Thank you so much for being here with us. Also, Thank you, because I've been working pretty closely with your staff to set up meetings for the marshalling yard, and we've had a really good experience working with y'all and reaching out to the community about their concerns. I did have a few follow-up questions to that end, though. What security measures are being considered for the shelter residents to ensure gender safety? Will there be any sort of dividers between shelter residents for male, female, trans, or gender nonconforming community members?
Yeah. So we have asked our offerers to give us their sort of plans around safety and security. I would anticipate that there will be separation by gender. Whether, precisely what that will look like, we'll need to see what comes in from our proposers. But at present, do not anticipate that there would be completely mixed population.
Got you. And with that, is part of the RFP that the shelter staff will be adequately trained for mental health and mental health needs and trauma services?
Yes, sir. In fact, so we require that there be training for de-escalation, mental health first aid, trauma-informed services, and do ask those folks to lay out for us how they plan to achieve that for their staff.
Thank you. I know that there's a proposed shuttle service. Is that correct? And will that be used solely to transport people to and from the nearest bus stops? And will there be like direct transportation to resources and appointments?
Yeah, I would expect it would be a little more broad than just to transportation points, but that again is one of the things that we've asked folks to lay out for us. And I'll also point out that when we have a recommended vendor, then we do have an opportunity to go back and talk to them about points of their proposal that we might like to revise or improve in some way.
Awesome. How are we going to be prioritizing which encampments will provide referrals to the marshalling yard?
So I think that one of the viewpoints that has been expressed by council and leadership broadly is if we're going to have enforcement, we need to have some place for people to go when they ask, where can I go that's legal? And so we'll be working closely, certainly with our homeless encampment management team to understand what's happening in terms of enforcement and hope to keep some portion of beds available for that. I also think that that won't be the only referral pathway. And so we've asked offerers to describe how they see referral pathways, but it will be in negotiation with the Homeless Strategy Division, and we anticipate having an active bed management group that looks at that ongoing, we don't just set it and forget it. And I think in particular, between these two facilities, we want to make sure that we are thinking about enhanced access for people who are medically fragile, who for one reason or another are experiencing greater vulnerability in an unsheltered situation.
Thank you. And outside of the ones that you mentioned, are there any other plans, or is there anything else in the works right now to expand or create more emergency shelters in other parts of the city?
Yeah, we've absolutely, I think, received clear direction from the manager to be looking at our prospects, and so are talking to lots of community organizations who may have an interest, may have a facility, et cetera. Obviously, something like that we need to solidify those options before we bring them to council, but are in the process of working through feasibility of potential projects. At the same time, we really think about what the resourcing would need to look like to advance those.
Thank you. What was the criteria considered for this, for picking specifically this location for the marshalling yard? For the marshalling yard,
I think we as a city, have really viewed these two projects as a crisis response. And so in terms of looking at city-controlled property, in the case of the marshalling yard, that had adequate space, that had adequate facilities, that we could bring the hygiene resources, et cetera, into, it really rose to the top very quickly in terms of it being viable to do this quickly. It also is not a space that was being used for public-facing services at present, so we weren't going to be competing with other services directly to the public.
Perfect. And thank you again. And like I said, it has been a joy working with your team. I appreciate y'all working very closely with my office on this.
Thank you, sir. I'll make sure and communicate that.
Thank you. Colleagues?
The marshalling yard seems to me, again, thinking back to the conversation about the setting up the legal camping sites, the expense involved, where the fencing and the restrooms and what I mean. You're gonna in other words, if you're starting from scratch, it's a substantial investment just to get it to the point. With the marshalling yard already having everything ready to go, and you really just need to activate it where it has the space. Obviously, there's still a lot of beds and whatnot that has to be purchased, but it just seems to me to be an opportunity, a low cost, relatively speaking. Obviously, I think $9 million or so is a budget. Obviously, it's not like nothing, but just having that facility there. Convention center is going to be presumably, shutting down to be rebuilt. So I don't think, again, we've got an empty city facility. We need to activate it. There's costs involved, but I mean, again, it seems to me to be a relatively kind of self-explanatory and logical kind of investment in resources. Salvation Army as well. I mean, again, you've got an empty building there. It has been used as shelter. It's right next to the arch. Again, I just given the situation, hard to see why we wouldn't kind of jump in and use it as an emergency shelter. So I appreciate, your office and the city manager's office jumping on those opportunities, and showing kind of that bias to action. It's greatly appreciated. Quick question, rapid rehousing. And again, I kind of think I know what that means, but it jumps out because of $45 million of the original ARPA investment. Actually, we ended up spending about 42 on rapid rehousing. What exactly is rapid rehousing? What does it mean? What does it involve?
Excellent question. And I do think that sometimes we talk about permanent supportive housing as shorthand for any long-term housing, and that is a much more specific intervention. Rapid rehousing is time-limited. Typically around a year on average, but up to 2 years, could be anywhere from 2 to 3 months to 2 years, rental assistance and case management. It is, in contrast to permanent supportive housing, pretty much always in scattered site units. You got to go find a unit, right? Now, we as the city have incentivized our affordable housing developers to set aside a few units in their affordable housing projects that accept direct referrals for that. But they're not, it's really, they don't have additional subsidy in those units for that purpose. And so this is really intended for people who need some support, who have some barriers to overcome, but who we don't necessarily anticipate are going to need robust services for for an indeterminate time period. And if they can, say, access affordable housing some other way, don't necessarily need the depth of affordability we might see in permanent supportive housing. As a reminder, permanent supportive housing is intended for people who have experienced chronic homelessness and who are living with a disability. Really, we understand that but for that robust service and rental subsidy are very likely going to have a difficult time maintaining stability.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And I remember going out to Community First and talking to Alan Graham out there, and where he made that mention of, like, most of these people are not going to be like working and finding jobs. They're ill. They're older. It's just they are where they are, and we have to deal with them as they are. Yes, potential for part-time employment, but the idea that they're going to be in a year they're going to be perfectly self-sufficient members of society that can move out. So again, the permanency of the supportive housing, I appreciate that, and I completely see how that's. So these are folks that are kind of more recently homeless for rapid rehousing, not necessarily
Often.
chronically homeless?
Yeah, often. I will say that the lack of resources in our community has resulted in a scenario where sometimes people who could have been served with a lighter touch resource have been waiting for so long, right, that they now have reached chronicity and have more complex needs. But yes, in general. And I also, you mentioned that of the $45 million within the ARPA plan for rapid rehousing. The ARPA investment plan did have some capital for permanent supportive housing. We did not use it for services because we know it's a one-time resource, right? So we can't really ramp up and then drop off our portfolio of permanent supportive housing. With rapid rehousing, we have to be thoughtful about how we do it, but we can have a temporary program expansion and then, come back down to baseline or somewhere near it just by attrition.
So that's why it jumps out here, because it's good one-time use money as opposed to PSH. You're going to have that.
We need to know that we can sustain it.
Maintain. Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Yes, Councilmember Alter.
I want to pick up right where he left off on rapid, and are all our housing vouchers, would we consider that through the rapid bucket, or is that?
No, and when we say sort of our housing vouchers, the community's housing voucher come from a diversity of sources. They come directly through HUD to our service providers through the Continuum of Care Funding Program, which ECHO helps coordinate. They come through our housing authorities. HACA has really stepped up in the last couple of years and helped provide some of those long-term vouchers. And then the city has a very modest pool of project-based vouchers. There's other rental assistance that we don't usually think of as a voucher because it's time limited. And so normally when we talk about a voucher, which is as long as you still qualify from an income perspective, you can keep the voucher. Most of that is in permanent supportive housing. We do sometimes have pools of vouchers where say we've got folks in rapid rehousing and they've stabilized very significantly. They probably don't need the robust case management anymore, but may need the affordability of a voucher longer term. HACA works with us to connect those folks to a voucher, so as they roll off the caseload of a rapid rehousing program, they have that stability.
So for and I don't know what the exact number is, I've heard 500, 600, but tenant-based vouchers that we have individuals within the continuum who have this voucher but just can't find a place that will accept it. Are those HUD vouchers or who's?
So I'm going to guess, we have ECHO folks here. So I think when we talk about that, we're probably might be a little more specific to say they have some form of rental assistance. Maybe it's a long-term voucher, maybe it's not. But our data folks back here might be able to give us some insight.
I can follow up with them later. But essentially where I'm going with this and trying to think, as you look at the shelter capacity question and the dollar question, that is, if we have, let's say, 500 people with a voucher in our shelters and we can spend a little extra to make that voucher worth the market in Austin, we now have created 500 shelter beds just by moving them from shelter to housing, and we didn't have to build any facility at all. And so the efficiency there versus building a whole new site, to the degree you're able to do any of that kind of analysis within the cost structure, I would just be interested to know what kind of dollars we're talking about. If it's hundreds of thousands, millions, just what that looks like.
Excellent. Yeah, let's talk.
That's it.
Thank you. Ms. Gray, one of the questions, or I guess this information that came to light from the point in time briefing was that during the PIT count, I think the number that was given was 70% of our emergency shelter beds were being utilized on that night. So if we know that we currently have existing capacity 30% within our emergency shelter system, we are now standing up the marshalling yard to increase our emergency shelter system even more. Just want to take a moment to pause and think through that. What additional strategies are we going to employ to ensure that our unhoused community utilize the shelter beds?
Right. So that, when we spoke a little bit about a coordinated referral pathway and bed management, I think is a big piece of this. And we'll certainly catch up with our colleagues at ECHO. I think we want to look across, we want to look at each shelter. Is there a differentiation by type of shelter? I will say one of the things we know at our bridge shelter is that One impact of moving entire encampments into shelter at the same time is that you have to hold some beds open for a little while because you may be moving 40 people in over the course of a week. And so there's a trade-off there between utilization rates, right, and what we think is very valuable in terms of resolving encampments. But I do think ensuring that we as a system have some visibility into where the vacancies are, in all of our shelters at any given time will really help us ensure that there are folks have access to those beds when they need them.
So some of the concerns I've been hearing from the community is, we're making this large investment in the marshalling yard, allocating $9 million to increase our emergency shelter capacity. The concern is, are we doing this at the expense of investing in the longer-term solutions like permanent supportive housing, increasing our rapid rehousing even further? Can you share your thoughts on that, and how are we even as we open the marshalling yard, how are we scaling up our long-term strategies, or once this is only a one-year interim solution, so what happens a year from now when we're posed with the question of closing the marshalling yard? At that point, what happens?
Absolutely. And, certainly it is true that we can only spend, each dollar in one place. And so the slide that showed the reallocation of funds within the ARPA investment plan, it's true. We have had to move money around, but I will say it is the majority of that is not from permanent housing per se. Most of our ARPA investment remains in rapid rehousing. I think that it will absolutely be necessary for us to do a couple of things, really, I'm sure more than a couple. One is we're building this portfolio of potential future shelter beds that will be something that, leadership, council, and the rest of the community can consider as to whether we have options for expanding those beds. That we're looking at how we're utilizing these temporary facilities thoughtfully and planfully demobilizing them. I do not intend for us to be in the sort of place we were with Salvation Army where we were surprised. And so, in that event, you begin to ramp down a bit in the last couple of months. So you probably stop taking new folks in. With the level of permanent housing resource we have in our community right now, I feel much more comfortable that, okay, we've got, potentially up to 300 people, right, at Marshalling Yard as an example. But if we know we've got a permanent supportive housing project opening, if we know that we've got the majority of those folks are enrolled in rapid rehousing and actively looking for their permanent apartment, et cetera, that we're really thoughtful about it. It will be a challenge. We're going to have to be really smart about it, but I think that we can prepare for a smooth transition. It will require us identifying the resources for where those people transition to, certainly.
And so to share back with the community, we're opening up Marshalling Yard, but what additional steps are we taking in a concrete way to scale up the permanent supportive housing?
Certainly. So of the 1,000 units or so that are still in the pipeline, and we're happy to provide that report to council, in detail about where those projects are. The city has substantial investment in many of those deals from a capital standpoint, or service dollars, et cetera, which is being complemented by resources from private sources and the state and other jurisdictional sources. So we continue to actively work that pipeline with our partners, and are happy to provide more information. I'll also say, note that we are, as we speak, expanding capacity at the bridge shelters to begin to build out that longer-term capacity. And
have you been engaged with the Austin-Travis County homelessness response system?
Yes. So I sit on the leadership council, as does our equity officer, and our staff and other city staff participate in really all of the committees and most of the work groups of the leadership council. While these particular, we didn't go and do specific community engagement prior to announcement on these particular projects, there's been extensive engagement on the shelter assessment generally, and we, are in contact with them really almost daily. And I will say, be providing responses directly to some of the concerns that have been raised by the Leadership Council about the temporary facilities.
Good deal. And almost last question, the 8% that remains, and thank you for providing an update on the ARPA spending framework and given the reallocation to support the opening of the marshalling yard. That remaining 8%, what are you thinking, envisioning that those dollars could be utilized for?
Right. So those are the 5 categories that I mentioned. We've got carrying costs for a couple of hotel conversions where we have some repairs or costs to do before we turn it over fully to the nonprofit operator. There is about $750,000 that currently we do have set aside to seed additional shelter projects. We have capacity building for our community nonprofits. You guys may recall that we have been working with the Innovation Office to really help some of our smaller nonprofits that have been dedicated in this space, but smaller, much more likely to be working with substantial volunteer staff, et cetera, also much more likely to be BIPOC-led organizations to help them build the capacity to get to the point where they can access and utilize city funds. So we had, in our plan, had 2 phases of that. We're in for phase 1 now. We have $1 million for phase 2. We have $1 million for landlord engagement to get access to more units, and then just about $300,000 for communications purposes.
Okay, so the remaining 8% has been...
Yeah, we have
kind of
plans.
earmarked
Certainly,
for now.
yes.
Okay. All righty, colleagues, any final questions? Yes.
Just one more. In your experience, in your opinion, do we get better outcomes when people who are chronically homeless go through bridge shelter or emergency shelter before entering into permanent supportive housing, or is it fine to just have them go off the streets into permanently supportive housing?
I think that people can absolutely be successful going straight into housing so long as they have adequate support in that housing, and they usually do in PSH. What I will say is our success and the time it takes to get people from the street into that housing, sometimes shelter is useful because the case manager that's working with them knows where to find them, right? They're less likely to experience other trauma or health issues during that period in which they're applying and we're preparing to get them into housing. So I don't think it is a necessary stop in terms of they don't need to sort of get housing ready, but from a system flow perspective, we have seen that it can be helpful, for moving people into that permanent housing.
As kind of a gap-filling measure between, kind of chronic homelessness.
It's a stable place for folks to be it's almost a staging area, right? To get ready and get them in.
Probably a good way to put it. Thank you. That was my last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
As always, thank you.
All righty, colleagues, any further discussion, any thoughts on future agenda items for the committee to consider? Nope. All right, seeing no further business, it is 11:47, and I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you so much.
Should things go wrong, you don't know what to do. Just call on me, babe. I'll do anything for you. A bigger steel, babe.